and then and again, this is sponsored by Birding Eastern Shore, and we're a nonprofit here on Eastern Shore. The board members want to raise your hand so that people can know it's all volunteer board. We just do public education with our field trips, free field trips, and free programs. And this is one of our speaker programs that we're having this year. It's the second time we've been talking about Ospreys, and the situation has not gotten any better. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Bryan Watts from the College of William and Mary. Thank you.
Thanks, Roberta. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for all y'all's interest in Osprey. We're probably going to be short on time, so let's see if we can roll.
It was just working.
I know.
Oh, no.
All right, let's see. This shows a sort of representation of the marine food web, and what you can see here is the location and importance of forage fish. Forage fish are sort of the energy changers within the food web. They allow for the rest of the food web to have access to the vast energy stores that are located in the plankton. So they feed on plankton, they concentrate that energy in their tissues, and then those tissues are available at higher trophic levels that you can see up here. Forage fish are not all fish. So there are several dozen species around the world. Some of these are arthropods, some of them mollusks, most of them are fish, but not all. The key is that they serve the same general ecological function within the food web. And let's see. Although these things are taxonomically diverse, it's many different species that serve this role, they do share a lot of characteristics together. Most of these species have high reproductive rates. They can produce a lot of offspring. They often occur in large schools. They have high lipid content, meaning they have high energy content that they concentrate. And they go through boom and bust cycles. So from year to year, we can get big cycles in these species. All right. An example of that you may be familiar with, we're getting feedback now.
Yeah, sorry. It's me.
An example of this is the Pacific sardine. That may be one that you're familiar with from Steinbeck's Cannery Row. Pacific sardines at one time were the largest fishery in the world. And you can see that Steinbeck's novel was centered during the Depression, sort of the 1930s. What you may not know is that about a decade later, that fishery would entirely collapse. And you can see here, they collapsed in the 1940s, so that was 80 years later. They have never recovered from that collapse. So that entire industry has been gone for a long time. And one of the lessons from Pacific sardines and a number of the other forage fish from around the world is that when you are going down a population hill, like you can see here that happened in the 1940s, one of the keys is to take your foot off the gas and give that stock time to recover. Okay, let's see if this is working. Nope. Beginning in the late 1940s, fisheries scientists around the world began to warn us not to fish down the aquatic food chain. At that time, most of the commercial fish were here in this particular trophic level. And their point was that if we fish down the food chain, we're cutting off our own interests because we're then making this particular energy source no longer available to the species we're interested in. This was 80 years ago. We didn't listen to them then, and we still aren't listening to them today. Right? So what do we do with these forage fish? There are two main product lines that come from forage fish. One is oil that you may be familiar with, omega-3 oils. So we take these fish and we boil off the oils. What that leaves is proteins. We dry out the proteins and we make that into fish meal. So those are the two product lines from forage fish. Historically, we have fed the fish meal to regular stock like pigs and chickens. So we've used that fish meal for that purpose. Let's see. If we look at the growth of the forage fish industry, we can see that by about 2014, we were harvesting in the neighborhood of 22 million metric tons per year globally. A huge industry worth about 15 to $20 billion a year. And what you can see from these maps is that now we have forage fish industries in all of the world's oceans. So this is very widespread globally. It's a very important industry globally. All right. And I mentioned to you that historically we have fed those to traditional stocks like pigs and chickens. You may or may not know that 2 years ago, we sort of reached a milestone globally. 2 years ago, we, for the first time, ate more farm-raised fish than wild-caught fish globally. That was a major milestone, and it represents the expansion of aquaculture globally. That expansion is projected to continue to increase, and it is what is driving the increase in demand for fish meal. Okay, so what we used to feed to pigs and chickens, increasingly we're feeding to farm-raised fish. And most of the sort of commodity speculators believe that somewhere in the 2030s, we're going to reach an impasse where the global demand for fish meal will outstrip the global supply for fish meal. And so at that point, we'll have to make a decision as to where the protein source comes in order to continue to grow that industry. That decision is already being made. Increasingly, a lot of the fish meal contains plant-based proteins. And so that really is probably the future, right? There we go. So there are a number of consumer species, bird species, fish species, marine mammal species throughout the bay that depend on forage fish. Here's a couple of bird species, eagles, that's a pelican nest up from above Tangier, northern canids. There are many of bird species that we have here in the bay that depend on these, right? Let's see if it works now. Yes. But one of them sort of stands out, and that's the osprey. We have used osprey globally as an indicator for aquatic ecosystem health for a long time, maybe 50 years. But for most of those decades, we were using it as an indicator of contaminants in the ecosystem. Increasingly over the past decade or so, we're using it more and more as an indicator for fish stocks, okay? And so why osprey? Why are they so great for this purpose in the Chesapeake Bay? One is that they're complete fish obligates. About 98% of their diet is fish, and so they're completely tied to fish. They're widespread. I just mentioned that pelicans also eat forage fish, but pelicans may nest in 4 or 5 places in the Chesapeake Bay. Osprey nest throughout the Chesapeake Bay, so they give us a broad view of what's happening in the bay. They're highly visible, so unlike stripers, which you know also depend on menhaden, we can watch osprey much easier than we can watch stripers. And the other great thing is that there are a lot of available metrics that we have for osprey, and that makes them a great indicator species. Let's see. Yikes. Yes. So about 8 years ago, I started to get contacts from local watermen down in the lower bay, and also a lot of private residences that had Osprey platforms that they had watched for a long time that their Osprey weren't producing, throughout the lower bay. So this continued for a couple of years. I got calls from these people concerned about their Osprey. And so finally I said, okay, we'll look into that. And when you think about demographic things that influence population change, there are really two of those. One is reproductive rate and the other is adult survival. But when we think about food as influencing the population, it's really this pathway here that we're most interested in, and that is prey through reproductive rate to population. It's this pathway here that we would be most interested in. And so this is mostly what I'm going to talk about tonight, is this linkage here and what we know. So here is the same linkage here. And the great thing is that we have a number of different metrics that we have been monitoring for a long time that are related to this linkage. The one that stands out as probably the best overall indicator of this relationship is brood reduction. And so what do I mean by brood reduction? I'll show you, give you an example of what I'm talking about in terms of brood reduction. This is what I refer to as a symmetrical brood. You can see here there are 3 chicks in the nest, and they look like sort of identical triplets. And that's because they're developing at the same rate. When you look at their plumage, it's similar, and they look at like they're about the same age, about the same size. So they're developing equally. And we can contrast that to this that I refer to as an asymmetrical brood. In this particular brood, it's a triplet brood here. You can see there's an alpha, a beta, and a gamma chick. The gamma chick there, the little one there, is what we might commonly call a runt. So asymmetrical broods are indicators of food stress. And so what I mean is that there's not enough food coming into the nest to equally provision these chicks. And so they're developing at different rates. Okay, this is an asymmetrical brood. So how does that happen? What happens is, and so this is an adaptation that Osprey have to match the brood or the demand for food to the supply of food that's coming in. That's what brood reduction does. It allows the Osprey pair to match demand to supply. And this is how it happens. So if there's not enough food that's coming into the nest, what happens very early on is that there's a dominance hierarchy formed within the brood. And you can see that here. These chicks are about 4 days old. But what you can see here is that the bird on the right there is in a dominant posture. See how his posture is? The bird there on the left is in what we refer to as a subordinate crouch. It's cowering under the dominant bird. This dominance hierarchy is maintained throughout the brood rearing period. And so when the female has food, it's the dominant bird that stands up to the female. She feeds him until he's completely full. If there's any food left over, she gives it to the subordinate chick. What this does is to ensure that at least that one particular chick will survive. If she fed them equally and there wasn't enough food, they'd both die. So this is the adaptation that Osprey had. Okay, this is the result of that. This is that brood about 2 weeks later. And what you can see here is that the bird on the left, the dominant one, there are 2 things here. This is the crop of the bird. You can see it has a full crop. It's been fed. This bird over here, which is the subordinate one, has an empty crop. It hasn't received any food. The other thing that you can see here is the breadth of the breast here. Look at the breadth of the breast there. Look at this one here. Okay, so that bird is emaciated. That subordinate chick would die about 2 days later from starvation. So this is what I mean by brood reduction. And we can see that in the broods when we look at it. Asymmetrical broods are an indicator of food stress. And that food stress, if there's not enough food, leads to this, brood reduction. Okay, I wanted to say something just in brief about the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is a natural estuary. There are freshwater inputs at the headwaters of the major rivers, and then we have oceanic inputs. Those the salt and freshwater mixes, and we have this gradient of salinity. The importance of that in the Chesapeake Bay is that it structures the community within the bay. So certain fish that are salt tolerant are more in the saltier waters. The ones that are freshwater tolerant are in the fresher waters. And so we get this structuring of the community. So keep that in mind. There are other things we could talk about salinity. You can see here that the salt water actually comes up the bay side of the shore here, and it circulates this way due to the Coriolis effect. You can see the freshwater inputs here, and you can see the gradient of salinity that we have along the major tributaries. Okay. Thanks. I wanted to briefly say something about the history. It turns out that during the DDT period, the osprey population in the bay collapsed down to the main stem. It collapsed down to waters that were about 10 parts per thousand salinity. Okay, so the main stem of the bay. You can see that distribution here. Here's why. So the hatching rate during the DDT era was in the 30 to 40% range. Okay, we didn't climb out of that until the late 1970s. Once we get into the 1980s, hatching rate was up in the 80 to 90% range. It has remained that since that time. So we are still in the 80 to 90% hatching rate. Okay. So once we recovered the hatching rate, the population began to recover. We have done two systematic surveys of the Chesapeake Bay osprey population. This one that myself, Marion, that's my wife Marion, on the Upper James, and Mitchell Bird did in 1995 and 1996. We surveyed over 900 tidal tributaries of the bay by boat in 95 and 96, and we mapped all the osprey pairs in the bay. We had about 3,500 pairs at that time. Okay, there was one previous survey to that, and that was done by Chuck Henney during the height of the DDT era. You can see that here. So that Chesapeake Bay population bottomed out at about 1,450 pairs. By the time we surveyed it, the population actually doubled in only 20 years. Okay. We have not done a survey since then, but from subsampling, I would project that the current population is somewhere in the 10 to 12,000 pair range. The Chesapeake Bay supports the largest breeding osprey population in the world. There's no other population that even comes close to the population that we have in the bay. So it's a huge population. It has always been important globally. During the DDT period, everybody looked to the Chesapeake Bay because we had 1,450 pair, they had none. So the Chesapeake Bay has always been important globally for osprey. If we were to put my survey on top of Chuck Henney's survey and look at where the growth in the Chesapeake Bay has been, here's what it looks like. So the main stem of the bay, which was the refuge for osprey during the DDT era, hadn't really grown that much. The growth in the population since that time has been in the lower salinity reaches, and that continues today. Those areas in the lower salinity reaches, upper headwaters of the tributaries, continues to grow today. Okay, so the population has been growing, but it's not been growing everywhere at the same rate. The birds have been radiating back out toward the fall line. The interesting thing is that you have to go back to the early 1900s until you see osprey in the lower salinity reaches. So there were generations of osprey biologists that worked in the bay that never saw osprey in the lower salinity reaches. They always thought they were a salt-related species. Okay. And so in 2006, when I had a graduate student, Andy Glass, Andy looked at the ecology of osprey in the lower salinity reaches and compared it to the high salinity reaches because we knew nothing about the ecology of osprey in the low salinity reaches, even though osprey had been studied for decades in the main stem of the bay. And there are many differences between those areas. You can see one here. This is a bird from the Upper James that's feeding on a blue catfish, and that's their primary diet in that area. They also breed earlier. They have higher broods now. There are differences between these salinity zones. And here is one of them. The diet is quite different because there are different fish available in the low salinity reaches compared to the high salinity reaches. You can see in the low salinity reaches, they're feeding primarily on catfish and gizzard shad, whereas in the main stem of the bay, where it's more salty, they're feeding primarily on menhaden, spot, other species that are more salt tolerant. And so now I'm going to start showing you a little bit of data on what's been going on more recently. Mobjack Bay is a place that we have worked. Mitchell Bird started working there in 1970, and we have continued to work there, so we have a long history there. There's Mobjack Bay. You might know it. It's a small sub-estuary in the lower Chesapeake Bay on the western shore. And I want to show you some data from Mobjack. And what you can see here is that Mobjack Bay, in terms of the reproductive rate, was low during the height of the DDT. We climbed out of that, like I showed you earlier, up to the 1980s. Since the 1980s, we have traced back down. In fact, the productivity in Mobjack Bay currently, if you look across, is much lower than it was during the height of the DDT era. This was in 2023. We produced 3 chicks per 81 pair in Mobjack Bay. I didn't show you the recent data, but last year we produced 5 chicks for 85 pair in Mobjack Bay. So terrible reproduction there over the last few years. It turns out the reason that I have harped on Mobjack Bay isn't because it's the only place that we have worked, but it is the main place where we have had 4 generations of graduate students work there and doing intensive graduate work with Osprey in Mobjack. That began with Chris Stinson in the mid-1970s. So we have 45 years of data or so in that period. Chris Stinson and Peter McLean were Mitchell Bird's students, and Andy Glass, Michael Academia were my students there. Okay, and I want to show you some data across that time period and show you what's been happening and why it's been happening. That picture was of Andy Glass with an Osprey. This shows nest success. So the proportion of nests that produced at least 1 chick. And what you can see is that nest success has declined 60% since the 1970s here. For those pairs that have been successful, so these are broods that were produced, we can see a 40% decline. So these were successful nests, and these are the brood sizes in those successful nests. We've had a 40% decline in brood size. Those 2 things, success rate and brood size, give us the reproductive rate. That's the number of young produced per pair in the population. And what we can see is that we have had about an 80% decline in reproductive rate in Mobjack Bay over that 45-year period. And importantly, this is the most important issue, and that is to break even is this yellow line here. That's the number of young needed per pair to offset expected adult mortality. So if we're above that, the population would be expected to grow or be stable. If we're below that, the population is expected to decline. What you can see is that sometime during the 1990s, we crossed that line. So we went from a demographic source above the line to a sink, and that has continued to drop. So we're in deficit here. So Mobjack Bay is currently in deficit in terms of breaking even. And in terms of brood reduction that we just discussed, brood reduction has increased dramatically. Brood reduction was unheard of in the 1970s, and you can see it's the primary cause of nest failure now. 70% of the nests have evidence of brood reduction. Okay, so why is this going on? We happen to have provisioning data. So provisioning is the number of fish that males are bringing into the nest per unit time. And what you can see is that we've had a 90% reduction in the provisioning or the fish delivery rate to nests in Mobjack Bay over that time period. We've also had change in diet. So when Peter McLean was working in the 1980s, over 70% of the diet was menhaden. By the time that Andy Glass was working in the 2000s, it was less than 30%. What you can see here is that Osprey have tried to adjust to this and have expanded their use of other species here. But what I want to point out to you is that all of these fish are not the same. So not only have we had a reduction in the rate at which fish are being delivered to the nest, the quality of the fish has declined by 50%. And that the reason is because we have moved away from menhaden. Menhaden are unique in that they're a high lipid prey. That's the reason why we catch them as forage fish, but it's also the reason why osprey need them. Menhaden have about 200 kilograms per kilocalories per gram of fish. Most of these other species are down about 100 kilocalories per gram, so about half. So not only have we had a reduction in the delivery rate, the energy content of that has dropped 50%. Okay. And this is the delivery rate, the recent delivery rate of menhaden, which has dropped 80% since the 1980s. Okay. In 2021, Michael Academia, who is a graduate student of mine, and I did a food addition study. That is, we had control nests and we had experimental nests. For the experimental nests, we provided menhaden twice a week to females. Here you can see that. Okay, so we provided these fish into the nest. We were able to successfully drive reproductive rates in the experimental nest back to the 1980s level, where they were above break even. The control nest continued to be in deficit. Okay. So I'm using this slide to summarize what the problems are with the demography. I'm sure you're familiar with the story about Japan. So Japan is in crisis. Why are they in crisis? They're in crisis because, similar to Osprey, they were producing more children than they needed to offset adult mortality until, you can see here, about 2008. And at that time, their birth rate declined, and you can see that the deficit is increasing. And so because of that deficit, you can see that the population is in decline. In fact, Japan is in a demographic death spiral, okay? And the only way to get out of that is either to have immigration or produce more of these, right? So they are in the same situation that Osprey currently are in the Chesapeake Bay. Osprey are in a demographic death spiral because we're not producing enough chicks to offset adult mortality, okay? So after we published the retrospective that looked at the 40 years, there was all kinds of outcry that it was not fish, you know, that Mobjack Bay was just a one-off, you know, it didn't represent the broader bay. It was this issue or that issue, it was something going on the wintering grounds, it was eagles, it was this or that. And so in 2024, I decided to expand the footprint of the work that we have been doing recently. And I expanded it to this contour. This is a 10 part per thousand salinity contour. This was a contour that I believe that Osprey were completely dependent on menhaden. Not just that they fed on menhaden, but their reproductive was completely dependent on menhaden. And so this was a study area that I decided to use in 2024. And these were the study areas that we studied in 2024. There were 12 study areas, including 500 pairs. You can see them here. 10 of those study areas were within the 10 parts per thousand salinity contour. I decided to use 2 reference study areas. These were in low salinity waters where we knew that Osprey did not depend on menhaden. The reason for doing this was that a number of the arguments that were coming at us were that something was happening on the wintering grounds, it was contaminants, it was disease, other factors. And so if that was the case, it was eagles. If that was the case, then we would expect these areas to also suffer from those problems, right? If it's menhaden only, though, we would expect that they weren't because they don't feed on menhaden. I also want to point out that all of these, there were 10 study areas here. These 4 here, I'm going to show you some data that compares back to the 1980s, okay, similar to what I just showed you from Object. And here's the results from that. What you can see is that none of the study areas in the main stem of the bay, these ones here that are 10 parts per thousand salinity, broke even demographically, none of them. These 2 low salinity ones, both of them exceeded break even, okay? So first of all, Mobjack Bay was not a one-off. It wasn't an anomaly. It did represent what's happening in the broader bay. We already knew that, but we collected this data to show it. All of these other things, eagles, for example, we happen to work with eagles. The density of breeding eagles in these low salinity reaches here are about 20 times higher than in the main stem. So if there was an issue with eagles, we would expect it to show up in the low salinity reaches, not the main stem of the bay, and the reverse was true. Okay. Something else happened in 2024 that we had never seen before, and you can see that here. Here's a female on the lower York River. We went by and checked on this female and many others multiple times during the breeding season. This is the way that she looked the entire season. She came in early February and stayed for the rest of the season. She was there every time. The male was also there. She never laid eggs, okay? And you can see that in the high salinity regions, this is the result of that. 27% of the pairs never laid eggs. In the low salinity regions, it was less than 4%. And if you go back in time to the 1980s for Mitchell Bird's data, it was less than 2% never laid. It's something that we had not recorded in the bay. And I believe it's because the females could not bring themselves into condition needed to lay eggs. Okay. I wanted to show you those 4 study areas similar to Mobjack and compare back to the 1980s real quickly. And what you can see is the reproductive rates were similar in the 1980s across all 4 of these areas. It was about 1.4, much higher than is needed for maintenance of the population. All of those declined significantly, similar to Mobjack Bay. And if we look at brood reduction, you can see that brood reduction has increased in all of those. Okay, brood reduction is what's driving the low reproductive rate that we have. It's about hatching rate. It is now brood reduction. During DDT, it was the pair's ability to bring eggs to hatching. Now it's not that. They are hatching eggs, but they're not able to bring chicks from hatching to fledging. So after 2024, one of the questions that kept coming back to us is, okay, so we know that the main stem is in deficit. What does that mean in terms of the broader Chesapeake Bay population, the entire Chesapeake Bay? And so I decided this past year that we would address this. The real question, the metapopulation question is there enough surplus in the low salinity reaches to offset the deficit we have in the main stem? In order to evaluate that question, we worked in 23 study areas with over 1,000 pairs. You can see those study areas here, okay? And so we went about answering, this relationship between deficit and surplus. And what you can see, these are the results of that. What you can see is that none of these areas outside of the low salinity areas broke even. All of these blue areas are the ones in low salinity reaches. All of those broke even. None of the ones outside of that did. And I was shocked by that. I thought that the pairs in, say, 5 parts per thousand or 7 parts per thousand would be doing better. This year, they did not. So the deficit extended all the way down to 5 parts per thousand salinity. That's about 70 to 80% of the entire surface of the Chesapeake Bay. That is about the extent, the salinity extent of menhaden when you look at their salinity tolerance. Okay. So to answer the metapopulation question, the answer is that in order for the entire Chesapeake Bay to break even, we would need 1.8 pairs, almost 2 pairs in the surplus for every pair in the deficit. Unfortunately, the reverse is true. We have 7.5 pairs in the deficit for every pair we have in the surplus. So the answer to the question is that no, the low salinity areas cannot rescue the main part of the Chesapeake Bay. We absolutely will be seeing a decline bay-wide, and it's likely that decline has been going on for some time now. Okay. So there's a sort of overview of these different contours. You can see that the 5 part per thousand contour covers a huge part of the entire bed. Okay, so where have we been and where are we? So whenever, my group is a research group. We happen to work with birds as a research subject. Whenever we come into these problems, you're faced with a box of uncertainty, right? There's all these questions that you don't know the answer to. And so our objective from a research perspective is to reduce the size of that box of uncertainty. So for the past 3 years or so, we've worked to do that with Osprey. I think we have reduced the uncertainty all the way down to a smaller and smaller point. There still are some questions remaining, but we've answered quite a few of those in a short period of time. So where are we in agreement? There are still some things that we don't agree about, but one of the things that I feel like are in agreement, even with the fisheries scientists, is that there simply is not enough menhaden in the bay currently to support a stable osprey population. Okay, they're just not there. So we have gone through this, right? We have looked at some of this. We've suggested through the metapopulation work that unfortunately we are in a situation where we should expect population change. So where are we now? So we're in agreement about this. Where we are now is here, and that is there's not enough menhaden in the bay. The question then turns to why is there not enough menhaden in the bay? Number of conflicts about why that might be. And I'll just say from my perspective that I'm a bird head, right? I'm not a fish head. And that's a question for the fish heads to address. It's really not my area of expertise. I can tell you what's happened with Osprey. The fisheries people don't like me to say what's happening with menhaden stock. Okay. And so there, how did I do, Roberta? I went over a little bit.
You went over, but that's okay. You're about right? Are you good now?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can put them off until after.
I think we're gonna put them off. Yeah, we're gonna put off the questions until Ben finishes his presentation.
You might work it.
Jeez, I gotta follow Bryan. That's a great talk.
Fine.
Yeah, you're Bryan to use that.
Yeah, the cookies not gonna be. Sorry. Yeah.
Do you want me to do your slides, please?
I can do it.
Thank you all. Can you hear me? Can't tell if this is working. Hope it is.
It works if you pull it up.
Closer,
Yeah.
much closer. All right. And I can talk loud too, so.
Or you could just talk loudly.
I don't know if everybody online can hear me, hopefully too, but well, yeah, thanks, Bryan. Wow, the research you're doing here is amazing. I have big shoes to fill. Doing much less research myself, but more management of ospreys, which, hey, at least I'm here to share what we're doing in New Jersey. So I'm really happy to be here. So a little bit about myself. I've been working with Ospreys for 20 years in New Jersey. I started out as a field technician for New Jersey Fish and Wildlife and was kind of thrown into the gamut straight out of college of like, hey, go do this, go do that. So I've worked with horseshoe crabs, shorebirds, bald eagles, peregrine falcons, tree frogs, you name it. But ospreys are one of those species that I also worked with, and that's where I was just kind of, hey, given a map and brought out on a boat with a ladder and some bands and was taught to band. And now over the past 20 years, I've worked with ospreys all throughout the state. My main focus for them has been maintaining their nest structures, which I'm sure you all know here in Virginia, they rely mainly on artificial nest platforms as well, but they'll nest on almost anything they can find over or near water. So I've installed over 250 osprey platforms in New Jersey for ospreys. So that's where a lot of my work has been concentrated on that, and now I'm busy taking care of them as well. So, we all know what ospreys eat just by watching them, right? So when we're out, we're birding, we're watching nests, we can see what ospreys eat by what they're carrying. And for me in New Jersey, we're privileged to have a lot of people who wheel cameras along the shore. And that's where we have a lot of pictures, of course, where you think of ospreys flying back from the ocean, where they find their main prey and bringing it back to their nests. And the majority of that is menhaden. There's no mistaking it. But yeah, so that's where I know here ospreys nest on a lot of like docks and other structures, or channel markers. There's just so many ospreys here compared to where we are. We have about 800 nesting pairs in New Jersey, and about 3/4 of them nest along the Atlantic coast. And a lot of those are on back bay marshes and nest on platforms like you see here. But then we also have birds nesting on utility poles, of course, which the utility companies really hate, but they can be successful on those structures as well. They're just a lot more dangerous, right? High energy. But yeah, so that's where we've had more pairs though nesting as the population has grown on other structures, more natural structures, which I kind of see as a glimpse back in time of where ospreys nested historically, either on the ground or on sandbars like this, which we have more and more of now in New Jersey, where structures wash up on the marsh and they find them and build nests on them. And also, of course, they nest in trees too. So in here you could just see just kind of an overview of New Jersey, and I'd really like to point out, which is really kind of cool, and Bryan's map too, ospreys pretty much delineate our shorelines, from them being fish eaters. And here you can really see it in New Jersey, just how well that's portrayed. So this is my little neck of the woods right here in New Jersey. So I live in Manahawkin, which is right on Barnegat Bay. This is where we have about 150 osprey pairs that nest. Very, 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 very small compared to the Chesapeake, but that's Long Beach Island right there as well. And so this is where a lot of my work has been concentrated. And their prey, again, how we identify it obviously is, at their nests when they're feeding, right? So that's a bird on a perch by a nest, when they're in flight going to nests, but also at nests. And one of the benefits of having a nest over the marsh is that's where we could actually identify the prey by the prey remains that are left. So that right there is a gill plate from a menhaden as well. And you can see the pile of them underneath the perch at a nest as well. So kind of taking a step back in time, and this will be great because I'll definitely mention the Chesapeake, but our ospreys, suffered very heavily from DDT, just like on the Chesapeake Bay, and our population fell from over 500 nesting pairs to only 50 pairs. This is from the 1950s, 1960s. Ospreys were also persecuted, and now even with more of the impacts we're seeing with prey availability, I highly believe that, Menhaden, played a role in that as well too, because that's when the highest amounts of Menhaden were harvested in the 1950s and 1960s. But yeah, so DDT basically caused our populations to collapse, hatching rates, which Bryan definitely went over. And, it wasn't until the 1970s when ospreys were listed as endangered and their recovery program was started through the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And what did biologists do? Well, they came to the Chesapeake and they collected osprey eggs, which were incubated and then placed in nests in New Jersey to basically jumpstart the reproduction again, because, the effects of DDT basically caused nests to, not be productive anymore. And so it wasn't until the late 1970s when nests started to become productive again and jumpstart the population again. And on top of that, what also happened was that nest platforms were installed, which we all know how crucial those are, because in New Jersey, our coast is so developed that most osprey nests, which were historically on like the high spine of, say, our barrier islands, were destroyed. So biologists worked very feverishly with other organizations and utility companies, especially even mosquito commissions, to install nest platforms all around the state. And that's where we have about 75% of our ospreys nest on platforms. So it really wasn't until the mid-1980s when the population recovered to the point where then their status was upgraded from endangered to threatened. But to monitor the population, of course, just what's going on here is biologists did surveys for them as well. So every year they go out and survey nests, and then aerial surveys were done as well too, either annually and then biannually. And, just some old pictures here that you could see from when birds were hacked in the northern part of the state, which wasn't really as successful because they found that great horned owls were voracious predators of ospreys up there. But yeah, so more recently, when I've worked with ospreys, their population has surpassed the historic estimate of over 500 nesting pairs. Just this year, they were actually listed as stable. So their population was upgraded to being recovered from the effects of DDT and habitat loss. And we now have over 800 nesting pairs in the state. So, but we don't really know the actual true population size because we only survey a portion of the state. But ospreys have pretty much flourished in all areas of the state, especially along the Atlantic coast and also the Delaware Bay shore. But really, what we found is that, the maintenance of their nest structures has really been crucial because without them, they won't even have areas to nest. But what we've seen more recently too, which I'm getting to the Menhaden side of things, is that, they've been hit very hard too by lack of Menhaden. I'll talk about that in a minute, but so what we do now to monitor ospreys, so this is where every year we have a small group of volunteers who goes out and does surveys. This is typically done only once in a season, not like what Bryan's research is doing. So we just try and get a glimpse of the overall population just to assess the health, to really determine how well they are doing. So that's where we're the only crazy people you'll see with ladders on boats, right? So we target our surveys during the early morning or late part of the day where we're not causing too much stress on the adults because, think about being out in the summer and running a marathon. It's the same for an osprey. But yeah, so we go to a nest, obviously, where we're looking to see how many nestlings are produced. We're counting them. We're documenting any kind of plastic marine debris that we see in nests, which you name it, we found it. We clean that out and we band young if they're old enough to be banded. More recently, we've been using cameras like a GoPro like this that you can see to actually look into a nest while reducing disturbance because we only band about 25% of young that are produced. So the camera is just a way to have a very short window of disturbance at a nest where we can capture our data, see how many young are produced, and then exit the area. And you know, that's where it's really been just a great tool, you know, to be able to operate at a nest, you know, much better than a mirror, which I've tried and abandoned real quick. And we've also used a drone as well too to survey nests as well. So, and I'll be looking forward to some drone questions as well too. And this is just another way to survey a nest while reducing disturbance as well, which is one of the things that I've wanted to do over the years. So another thing we've been doing over the past decade is banding young birds with auxiliary bands. So these are field readable color bands. We've been doing this exclusively on Barnegat Bay. And this is just a resighting project to basically learn about the young when they return as adults, to determine, you know, the turnover at nests, how old they are, and you know, how many others are potentially non-breeding adults that we see along the coast from year to year, and also where they disperse to or end up breeding as adults as well, and also where they migrate to. So even just the other day, we had one bird that I banded this past summer with the red band, which was only one of 11 that is still up on Long Island Sound right now. So a young bird, so pretty crazy. And it's interesting, but it had a menhaden as well too, which is good to know. So there you can see the color band. So that's where even any of you know, are birding down here, you know, to watch out for red-banded ospreys migrating south. Because we banded well over 500 birds, and every year they're moving south. So that's so you can just see, you know, some pictures here of some red-banded ospreys, you know, and some alumni here that we banded and are now tracking as breeding adults at nests, just showing where they originated from and where they're nesting. And from this, we know that males have a very, you know, they nest very close to their natal areas where females wander more. Another individual there that I banded with my brother, actually resighted that just a couple years ago. Well, yeah, so that's you know, like I said, the platforms are where, you know, many people think, oh, what do you do in the winter? You know, well, I'm the person who gets the call when the platform falls over and breaks. So we're out there repairing nests and really having a great core group of volunteers to go out and do this in the winter is really key, and I wouldn't be able to do it without them. So kind of getting into the menhaden side of things, and I don't even know how much time I have because I could just keep talking.
Definitely one here.
Yeah, so I've been working with Ospreys for long enough to, you know, notice different things that have happened. You know, we're not doing research like Bryan's doing, you know, we're more doing wildlife monitoring. So this particular colony, this is on the Mullica River, and this is referred to as one of the most pristine rivers in the Northeast because the headwaters are in the New Jersey Pinelands. So there's very little development, very little agriculture, you know, so there's not a lot of pollution or disturbance, but this colony here hasn't always thrived. They've had boom or bust years. And you can see where it's located there, and where's that little pointer? Is that somewhere in here? So yeah, so this is the Mullica River right back here. This is Great Bay, and this is Great Bay Boulevard. Pretty much most of the land, I think you can kind of see, is protected. It's part of like Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge, and this is Great Bay Boulevard, a wildlife management area in New Jersey. But one year in 2015, now when I look back at it, this was a year that menhaden, I believe, were driven into the river by striped bass and they got stuck. They couldn't leave. These were full-size adult menhaden. I mean, look at the picture of the osprey nest with all the fish in it. You know, I didn't put them there. That's just what they brought to the nest. But yeah, there were so many fish that they were washing up dead on the shoreline. You know, there were vultures eating the fish on the shoreline. And that nest right there too, it's interesting because the picture on the top of the female, right? You could see the osprey down in the Spartina. You'd like never see that, but that female actually at a nest only had one wing. And, you know, as a biologist, you know, Brian's probably like, oh, you know, he knows what would cause that, right? You know, it's an eagle, right? What else could, you know, harm or injure an osprey enough to make it lose its wing? And then this nest here, I believe that then the male was just overcompensating by continuing to catch food to feed his mate and potentially other young, because they only had one nestling that was probably predated by that same eagle. And here I am trying to advance my slide with that. Yep, but yeah, so this is a video which, you know, hopefully I can just get to play here by clicking on it. Yeah, just showing the fish in the river here, and those are vultures in the background there. They're literally all over the place, and I've never seen anything like this ever. Because typically we see menhaden out in the ocean in New Jersey, not in a back bay river. And here we can just compare years, which is something that I just wanted to look at this year, because this was, which I'm getting to as well, was the worst year Ospreys ever had in New Jersey. But, you know, we compare 2015, where menhaden were so abundant that they're washing up dead on the shoreline, to this year, it's a complete opposite. So, and that just shows right there, you know, how well they can do with abundant menhaden. And this is just your typical Jersey Shore scene. These aerial photos were from a photographer up in Monmouth County who got pictures of schools of menhaden right along the coast, right in nearshore waters, where you'd think an osprey would be foraging for them. And then even bigger schools like this that you could see as well. This again is up in Monmouth County. This was in October. So this is kind of past the season when ospreys would really benefit from it, but still just shows the abundance of menhaden that we've had along our coast like this. And you could just see here too, there's then the osprey, you know, view of that, or a smaller school of fish there too with the dolphin. But yeah, so then, you know, moving on here, so, you know, where we've seen, you know, even what Bryan talked about very concisely is brood reduction. We've seen it through the lens of not only just our surveyors, but also osprey camps. And this is where we've seen it through live streaming cameras where young are lost during the breeding season. And, you know, which is pretty tragic to watch, but it's a great tool for really, you know, documenting this when you're not actually out there seeing it firsthand. And typically we've seen it when we've had storms, coastal storms. So now I'll just kind of spotlight like our Osprey cam, which is right on Long Beach Island on the Atlantic coast of New Jersey. We've had this camera up since 2019. And I'm going to go through the years from 2020 to 2025, just documenting their success or, you know, failure. And we also, and the reason why I'm showing these years is because we actually worked with one of Bryan's students, Michael Academia, to document the prey brought into the nest through watchers or viewers of the camera. So that's where you'll see the pie chart there kind of showing the fish that were brought to the nest and the outcomes. So 2020, typical year, no storms, 3 eggs, 3 young. All right, then we have 2021. We had a new female come in and, you know, there were no coastal storms and they laid 2 eggs and 3 eggs were laid and 2 young fledged. The youngest was outcompeted just by there being some food stress that we could see. 2022, we had a coastal storm. So this is where we had a nor'easter hit the coast. This was in May, and this caused, you know, the female to leave the nest for longer periods because the male was fishing more. So that left her eggs exposed. And unfortunately, not even related to that, the female accidentally pushed one of the hatchlings outside of the nest bowl and it died. Where it kind of went outside It's crazy to even think that that could even happen, but it did, where then she didn't even care for it. But they fledged too young that year. So the storm, had some impacts, but not as great as then 2023. And this is where another coastal storm happened. And the male disappeared for 72 hours. So he was gone. He had two nestlings, or sorry, he had three, because one fledged, but two of them were lost when he was gone. They starved to death, from just lack of food when he was missing. And that's because the storm basically made it so hard for him to forage and basically caused the menhaden to disappear. I mean, so that's one of the things that we don't really know is what happens to the menhaden during these storm events. We know that they kind of can go deeper and move offshore, but they just completely disappeared. 2024, so this is actually, where Bryan talked about it, we actually witnessed the same thing that he witnessed for the first time, was that this female at this nest did not even lay any eggs for the first time. And prey, as you can see, was very plentiful. They were eating plenty of menhaden, her and her mate, but she did not lay any eggs. And we did not have any storms as well, too, to really affect, her young, but she didn't have any. But it still shows that, like what Bryan's seeing, that she did not even get into egg laying condition that year. Now this year, we had a new female pair bond with the previous male who is 19 years old. And this year we had another nor'easter in late May, and he was missing for 67 hours. And when he was missing, a gull came in and predated all of their eggs because the female, again, had to leave to go and find food. And yeah, so now this year, and these are pictures of ospreys this year with menhaden. And, I can tell just from this picture, and when you see some of the other ones, that the fish are just much smaller, right? Remember seeing the other pictures of the menhaden that ospreys had? We can see that their age class is much younger. They're much smaller fish. So there's still menhaden out there. They're just not abundant and as large as they've been. So one of the things, we did this year with seeing that nest fail, we were doing more surveys, because typically, like I said, we do one survey, we go out and count the number of young, and we ban them. Well, this year we went out and did more surveys earlier in the season just to document if nests actually had eggs, then to come back and do follow-up surveys like what Bryan does. So that's where you can see just some pictures here of eggs and or no eggs. Like that nest, and one particular nest in one colony, which we kind of call the most densely populated colony of ospreys in New Jersey. We have 40 pairs in less than 2 square miles. This is right off the beach by Barnegat Inlet, but we had a pair of bald eagles take over an osprey nest. So great kind of study area to even take what Bryan said of like, hey, it's easy to just say the eagles are the ones who are killing all the ospreys. Well, I specifically went and surveyed all of the nests around that eagle nest. And here's just where you can see where Sedge Island is. So the Mullica River was down here. This is Great Bay, and then this is all Barnegat Bay. And then Sedge is this little pocket of islands right inside Barnegat Inlet. So obviously they have access to our estuaries for foraging, but the majority of their foraging they do in the ocean for menhaden. Well, yeah, and that's where you can kind of, I don't know if you could even see, the eagle nest was right here. So kind of centrally located within the osprey colony. And yeah, so every nest by the color there too, all the black ones failed. So they didn't produce any young at all. And the only ones that did were the ones that are orange over here, up there, and then there was a couple down to the south. But yeah, when we surveyed this colony, typically they produce around 55 nestlings per year. Every nest is occupied. And when my son and I actually surveyed this colony, the whole colony was like devoid of ospreys. There was hardly any ospreys around. Even after they failed, they just left. They weren't even present on their nests. and we can see, even from this nest, like I was trying to look for the other photo of this nest, which I have, that showed young in it, but they're gone. And you can see the eggshell there. But yeah, so, empty nests. And, from our earlier surveys too, we tried to target it right around when they were hatching, so we could actually capture some of that data of them producing something. And then, this same nest a couple weeks later just had an abandoned egg and no adults present as well. And to me, that says that it wasn't necessarily eagles. Eagles aren't going to eat their eggs. It just showed that food was obviously very, very scarce for them. And here we can kind of see this chart just showing our Sedge Island colony of the productivity rate, the number of young produced, and the number of nests of what this year looks like as compared to all of the previous years since 2003. So a pretty devastating year for sedge. Even though there were a couple nests where they did produce a few young that fledged, and on return trips, we did actually see those young flying on their own after fledging, which was great. So yeah, so our results for this year, we documented 683 occupied nests, 352 young. The productivity rate was 0.7, so the lowest ever recorded for the state of New Jersey. And brood reduction was very, very common. And that's actually the highest nest failure rate that we've ever seen as well, too. So, and that's pretty much all the nests where we actually know the outcome. And then there's just an overall chart showing, the overall growth of the osprey population in New Jersey with their productivity rate, showing other previous years where they've had some dips of lower productivity, which was attributed to harsh weather or wet weather in the spring. So yeah, so kind of closing thoughts here. So this year recorded the worst reproductive rate ever in the history in New Jersey ospreys. Menhaden were scarce. We know this not only just from what we saw, from our results, but also from commercial bait fishermen that fish on inshore waters in New Jersey that harvest the same fish that ospreys eat, and they even call ospreys their spotter planes. And so looking forward, though, we're looking to ramp up more of our surveys to actually try and better pinpoint what is going on. Is it the lack of menhaden there as well too? And so we're going to do that through cameras on nests and looking at prey through prey remains, and also expanding our citizen scientist monitoring of nests too to try and cover more of the population. We want to try and capture data at every single nest. So yeah, I want to take some questions with Bryan.
Okay. Thank you so much. Is this working? It is working.
Yeah.
Let's see, I had a couple questions. First for Bryan. Once the chicks are hatched, what can we do to help them survive on Eastern Shore?
Yeah. I think the problem is there are other things that influence survivorship other than food. One is disturbance. So, for years and years and continuing now, we have people that tie up, when they're out fishing, it's 95 degrees, they tie up, on the pole. That kind of thing can cause low reproductive rate because the chicks are overheated. Other than that, really the chicks need food. And, after we did the food addition study, there are some people that over on the Western Shore that started feeding, putting food out for the osprey, and they've been successful at doing that. In fact, some of you may know Urbana. We worked about 50 pairs on Urbana Creek on the Rappahannock this past year, and they produced 3 chicks. One of those was because a waterman who works there and has a dock would feed his osprey every day. Every day he would come in off the water and the female would come out to meet him. He would put fish on his dock. She would come and take the fish. And so one of those 3 chicks was produced because he was feeding them. There's some other people that have started feeding too. I hate to recommend that because it's not really a broad solution for our population. People are doing that and they feel great that some are being produced. In fact, over here on the shore, down on Hunger's Creek, the mouth of Hunger's Creek, there was a lady there that was feeding her osprey. They produced 2 chicks this year. But it's not something I think we should consider at scale. So really, I don't know. The best thing that we can do right now is to try to turn around what's going on with the Menhaden stock. I know there's controversy about where that stock is and whether it's sustainable currently or not. All I can say is what the Osprey are saying is that currently there's not enough Menhaden, and we need to do something to try to rectify that from a political standpoint. Sorry, that's not a better answer for that.
It's a tough question.
Do we know what the overall population number is for the bay?
Yeah, the best estimate that I have is the projections that I showed, and that is that the population, at least a couple of years ago, I projected to be 10 to 12,000, which is a huge population. It may be coming down from that. We do have some evidence. We haven't done another large-scale survey. I don't think that'll happen again. That's a major undertaking. We have seen some pullbacks. So I believe that the population is declining in a number of places. I know it has declined in certain places. An example is the Elizabeth River in Norfolk. So that population went up to 80 pairs. It's dropped down by 40% in the past few years. Fleets Bay is similar to that. I know that Fleets Bay on the Western Shore has dropped down in a similar amount. I'm having indications that the population is pulling off of that high of 10 to 12,000. Where it is now currently and where it's going in the next few years, I'm not sure.
Where on the Eastern Shore was your research done? South to north?
Yeah, so I subsampled the bay side of the shore, and there were 5 creeks there, from Hungers to Onancock, Occohannock, Nassawatic, Pungateague, Onancock, Hungers. And in there's about 80 pairs that we monitored. So that was the sample here on the seaside, on the bay side.
Do osprey need a certain size of Menhaden to feed on?
Yeah, from the diet work that we have done in the bay, most of the fish that osprey take, or the most common size classes, are 10 to 12 inches. So in that range, 10, 12, 14 inches. They'll take larger fish and they'll take smaller ones. Like Ben was just saying, one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years is they're starting to take peanut bunker that are that big. We've had a number of the residents who have platforms to tell us that. We've seen it ourselves where, I'm sure when you're out on the bay, you see the bait balls bunker there, little peanut bunker. Those are easy for osprey to come down on. The problem is those fish are about like that. They're about a third the size that osprey would normally take. And not only that, they don't have the lipid content that the adults have. So those things are like junk food. They're like eating a potato chip or something. They really don't have a lot of value. But when the other things are missing, those peanut bunker, they're taking. And I should say that we have not seen, no peanut bunker. When you go out over the bay on a calm day, there's a lot of bait balls of peanut bunker out there, right? I'm sure that when y'all are out there, you see them. But there's no real connection between those peanut bunker and adult Menhaden. So Menhaden are large spawners. They're spawning along the coast here, and those eggs are pulled into the bay by currents, And so you can have a lot of peanut bunker, and it may not reflect what the larger adult stock of menhaden is. Okay.
Are there any other species that you know of that rely on menhaden that are experiencing similar declines than Osprey?
Well, everybody points to stripers because stripers have had problems, beginning in the 90s. I guess I'll not go into that more than that. I don't know of other bird species that I can point to specifically. We have some indications of some other species that may. For example, when Mitchell and I used to fly the eastern shore here in the Eagle surveys, we would be flying in March. We would come out of some of the creeks there and see the roosting gannets. Okay, so we've seen flocks on the water of 30,000 gannets. 30,000 gannets is 30% of the entire North Atlantic population of gannets. Those gannets would come into the bay and they would stage here on menhaden. But I'm not seeing numbers of gannets like that anymore, and I'm wondering if they're not bypassing the Chesapeake because of the lack of menhaden. Many of these species, like common loons that come into the bay in the fall, they usually come in October, those birds are coming here to the bay to feed on menhaden. And when the temperature goes down and the menhaden go out in the bay and down off of the lower Atlantic coast, those birds are following those menhaden and they're spending the winter with menhaden. And so I wonder what's happening. We don't know. We don't have assessments of the stock of menhaden here in the bay. And I wonder what's happening with some of these birds that have historically staged here in the bay, specifically because of the menhaden here.
Does anybody else have a card? Any questions? Any questions? Actually, I've been following the menhaden regulatory process, and the most recent Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission meeting, actually I attended that in Delaware in early November, and there were a couple of interesting things about the menhaden. Number one, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission has heard from Maryland, and Maryland's representatives are saying that their bait fishermen are not getting any menhaden from the bay fishery for the bait. Virginia has 75% of the quota for menhaden. So the rest of the states have to divide up what's left of the quota. And Maryland has, they said that they believe that the Virginia fleet of reduction fishery is staging at their border and intercepting fish before they get to Maryland. So that is being studied. And the other issue that came up is that it turns out the population assessment that's been used for the past 3 years to set the quotas, they found a math error. And they have now said that in order to keep a sustainable fishery, that they would have to reduce the quota by 50% for the next 3 years of menhaden. Politically, that was just dead on arrival. And so they did vote to reduce the quota by 20% for 1 year. And what it turns out is that that omega protein that is the menhaden reduction fishery, the only one in the on the Atlantic coast, they haven't been able to meet their quota in the bay apparently the last year or two. So even reducing the quota isn't going to matter because they can't even reach their quota because there are no fish. So this whole question of, why are there no fish is still yet to be identified. Apparently fishing will not ever be the reason. long as it's something else. And one of the things I wondered from New Jersey is that what we're seeing in tracking the Menhaden fishery is that they're not able to find fish in the bay, and they're going to New Jersey. And I'm wondering if that has been tracked. If your volunteers or your operation is keeping tabs on, I know that they're going off the coast of New Jersey now and the mouth of the, Delaware Bay. Of course, they're not allowed in state waters in New Jersey or Delaware or Maryland. But at 3 miles, they're still gonna be able to get menhaden that are on their way. So just wondering how you tracked that, I guess.
In New Jersey, they do not know anything about menhaden offshore, at least with regards to abundance in the peak osprey nesting season. I mean, you saw some of the drone photos showing some of the migratory fish moving south, but when it comes to knowing what our ospreys depend on, we can just assume that it is menhaden at this point, but it's something that we're definitely going to be looking more closely at because we're seeing what happens when there isn't enough fish. So, similar to what Bryan's found on the Chesapeake.
Are there any discussions about how to assess what's driving the decline in menhaden? Do you have a thought on that? I've been going to the meetings and no.
Yeah, one of the things that's going on is menhaden are entering the bay. They used to enter in the mid-spring. Now, in 2024, the fleet didn't even really leave the dock until June. And that's because menhaden really didn't come in at all. And so, one of the reasons that the osprey may not have laid in 2024 is because the menhaden just hadn't come into the bay. And so we had a spike of laying in early June, which we'd never documented before. So the menhaden came into the bay, we had a spike in egg production in June, which we'd never documented before. None of those were successful. It's too late in the season. And this year it was even later. Menhaden didn't seem to come into the bay until July. So we had a lot of territory abandonment and so forth. The menhaden just were not coming into the bay early enough for osprey to really take advantage of that. You might ask, why don't the osprey just nest later? The problem is that osprey are squeezed on the front end by fish availability. They're squeezed on the back end by the late summer heat. And so even though the female stays there and broods, and she tries to keep the brood cool, she is not able to do that effectively in the late summer when it gets really hot. And so they are squeezed on both ends, and if the fish don't arrive on time, they're not going to be very successful.
I just another comment about the United States Marine Fisheries Commission. They seem to not be able to agree on a study to figure out exactly why they don't even agree that the population is declining. Let's put it that way. Even though the quota is not being met, I mean, the amount of fish that they used to be able to harvest compared to what they can harvest now, that they aren't even able to harvest what they would be allowed to harvest. It's staggering, really. It's probably four or five times more fish that they used to harvest. And there used to be a lot more of these reduction plants along the East Coast also. And I don't know, there's also been attempts to have a study in the Chesapeake Bay on the menhaden population, and that continues to be blocked by the reduction fishery. Been bills introduced like every year for the past 3 years to try to, get this study, and that has not been able to ever pass. So that's where that's,
It's called the Fox Washington Hen House.
okay, if the menhaden are getting smaller, is this still commercially viable with lower lipid levels?
Yeah, I can't speak about the commercial side of things. They're pretty divest about their operations and all. Like Roberta said, there were 25 reduction plants along the Atlantic coast from Canada all the way down to the South Atlantic. That was until about 1970s, and there was a big fallout of those plants at that time. Since that time, systematically, all of the states have outlawed the reduction fishery, except one. So now we have one plant there. Yes, that one plant used to harvest about 700,000 metric tons, and now the cap is 50. So, yeah, it was a different business earlier on than it is now.
This is for both speakers. Do you have any thoughts about aerial pesticide spraying, whether that might have an impact on menhaden or ospreys? I would assume that's sort of like the mosquito spray trucks that drive around these coastal areas.
No, commercial farming, you know,
Crops.
If I could just explain, so I live in both New Jersey and the Eastern Shore. And in New Jersey, aerial spraying on farms is not nearly as common as it is here on the Eastern Shore. And so I was thinking about the water system and how the spraying goes into the streams and then goes into the bays and how that might affect the ecosystem.
So I can speak for Osprey. So there are really high contaminant concentrations in the 1960s and 1970s. We really have not had any indication of a contaminant problem since that time. Barnett Ratner from USGS, who's really a contaminant specialist, not an Osprey specialist, he did a couple of legacy pieces. We have a couple of sort of holdovers. From the survey that we did in the mid-1990s, it was clear that most of the bay had recovered, with the exception of a couple of places, the Elizabeth River, the Anacostia, and Baltimore Harbor. Those places seem to have really slow recovery. He did some contaminant sampling in those places and the other parts of the bay. This was in the early 2000s, and showed that there were some holdover legacy compounds in those industrialized areas at that time. If you look now, 10 years later, he did another piece and showed that the legacy compounds, even in those holdover areas, had really declined to very low levels. So we don't currently have any indication that contaminant loads are causing any issues with reproduction. He had a PhD student, Rebecca Lazarus, who I also worked with, that looked at pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals became an issue in the bay when we started to see highly skewed sex ratios in some of the fish, where some of these places, most of the fish were females. And so it was because of human pharmaceuticals that were coming through the sewage treatment plants into the water column and affecting the gender of these fish. She looked at the transfer of pharmaceuticals through the food chain to Osprey. She was able to detect those, but there was no impact generally on productivity. So as far as we know currently, the problem with contaminants is that the game is never over. There are always new contaminants that are coming up. And so you have to be vigilant about those things. But currently, we don't think that contaminants are really having much of an impact on, at least on the Osprey. They may be for the fish.
Yeah, I think Bryan answered that pretty well. I mean, in New Jersey, we've had some, contamination studies that have shown, that there's still some trace levels of like remnants of DDT, like DDE, PCBs, but, nothing has really, been high enough levels to affect their reproduction.
Is there anything that members of the general public can do to help in the effort to protect Osprey and Menhaden?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think that the public is doing that. Ultimately, Menhaden in the Bay and along the Atlantic coast are a public resource, right? They're like other public resources that we have. And it's really, the allocation of that resource should be up to the public. And when the public says what they want, really the regulatory agency should respect that. And we haven't seen that so far, but it's been a fairly tough political fight. And what you can say is that industry has been very effective politically at getting their will. And so, if you have a thought about this, then you need to make your voices heard. And the public is increasingly doing that. Ultimately, the public will prevail on this issue. So I think that's the main thing that you can do now is let your voice be heard to the regulators and to the lawmakers until we're successful at turning this around. After all, it's your resource that we're talking about here. It's not industry's resource. It's a public resource. And they don't have any more right to it than you do.
That's all right.
Yeah, I agree, I mean, I think that this is something that, is a complete resource that is ours, a shared resource, and it shouldn't just be something that is profited on, by a corporation to make money. So, let's put it that way. So that's where I say to people, the big thing is really just understanding this fish or learning about this fish. Many people don't even know what it is. So that's the first step of talking to people, so talk to your friends, talk to your family, about how important this fish is, why it's important. And, then you can inform, or they can all speak out too, together, to our policymakers and regulators for change. So, and that's where I say, if this fish really is where it's at, and Ospreys are telling us that they're not doing very well. I mean, the fishery, you see what's happened to it already. They're gonna be out of business if they keep fishing the way they are.
I don't have any more questions, Parks. Yes, Dane.
Roberta, what regulatory body in Virginia makes a decision about the harvest of menhaden?
It's the VMRC, Virginia Marine Resources Commission. And they have had several petitions before them, probably 3 in the past 3 years, asking for a moratorium on menhaden reduction fishery until the science can be, till there can be a scientific study on the menhaden population and sustainability and ability to support other species in the ecosystem, such as osprey, dolphins, whales, gannets, any number of species that are relying on menhaden. They reject every petition, but it's close. It's like 4-3.
How many members are on that board?
I think it's 7.
And how many come from here?
Right now, there's 1.5. I would say 1.5. I'm not sure if Patrick Hand is considered here or across the bay. I guess it's 2. Patrick Hand and Jeanette Edwards. Yeah. Yes.
Tell us how the members of VMRC are appointed.
Oh, well, they're appointed by the governor.
Thank you.
Yes, and actually, I think the most recent governor appointed a couple of people who are right from the town where, Omega Protein operates, and they're connected with the industry, et cetera. But they follow what Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission says also. So Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission sets the quota. They're not really gonna change it. They're gonna just, go with that. I guess that's what generally happens, and I'm not an expert on that part of it, I just, have been getting involved because of the Osprey, because I was one of the people that contacted Bryan 5 or 6 years ago and said, there's something going on with these Osprey nests across the creek from me. It seems like they have a hatch, and then within a couple weeks, there's no chicks in the nest anymore, and they abandoned the nest, and I don't know what's going on. And at that time, I was surmising that it was a great horned owl, and but he didn't know at that point either, really. We hadn't this whole all these studies that have been happening weren't happening yet. It was just, what is going on in my Ospreys. And over the past couple of years, I've gone out on the boat with Dr. Watts on Nassawatis Creek, and we've had over 20 nests that were active nests with pairs, mommy, daddy, eggs laid, and then this year was staggering. I don't know how many nests were abandoned, 18 or something.
It was an unusual year in terms of abandonment. We haven't really had that before. Normally, Osprey come in and they set up territory early in the season, and they stay on the territory through the season regardless of whether they fail or not. Not this year. We had a lot of birds leave.
Yeah, it was about the 3rd week of May where the nests were abandoned, really kind of like all at once. It was crazy, and left the eggs or little chicks. That was the Menhaden were not in the bay yet. Omega wasn't fishing yet because the Menhaden.
They were out in the ocean fishing.
They were in the ocean, but yeah, they were in New
They catch them
Jersey.
before they came into.
Well, that's true too. So yeah, it just looked to me like it was lack of food, and the males weren't provisioning the nest, so the females had to leave and get something to eat. But yeah, that's the interesting thing. There's been this, I guess, rumor going around that it must be the bald eagles, but the bald eagles were gone too. I mean, there was nothing. There weren't even cormorants.
There's been a lot of discussion about eagles. I know some of them come from over here, some of them elsewhere. The eagle population has grown dramatically. It has been spectacular. I've flown for 30 years on an eagle survey, and it has been tremendous. So there are a lot of eagles around. And eagles do take osprey. They kill. I've seen them kill adults. I've seen them take chicks. There's no question about that. They are a factor in this. But we estimated in 2024 in the main stem of the bay that 5,500 osprey chicks were lost. Eagles did not eat 5,000 osprey chicks. The reason for looking in the tidal fresh is that the eagle density here is much, much higher. It's 20 to 30 times higher than it is here. So those osprey are productive. In 2024, we had 50 cameras on nests. We harvested over 1 million images from osprey nests. We didn't have an eagle image on one. So yes, eagle are taking osprey. They're not driving the pattern that we're seeing though.
So, is there any evidence that you're dealing with subspecies when you're looking at those that are eating the Menhaden and those that aren't, or are they completely opportunistic in terms of where they live?
Yes, they're opportunistic, the osprey. So if you look at osprey globally, they feed on many, many different fish species. And I should say that Menhaden aren't the only high lipid fish species that we have in the bay. There are, other good examples. Spanish mackerel, that's a high lipid prey. American eel, that's a high lipid prey. Blueback herring. So there are other ones that are high lipid, but all those other ones aren't schooling. So schooling behavior is another reason why ocean harvesters harvest Menhaden. They have high lipid, And they school in large numbers, so they're easy to catch. That's the same reason why they're so beneficial to Osprey. Okay,
Because they're easy to find.
yes.
All right, it's 7:15, and I think it's time to say goodnight, and I thank everyone for coming and thank you.
Yeah.